What if your entire life was built on a lie? For Alistair Finch, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single word, reality was a fortress built of wealth and steel. He had everything, and yet he had nothing. Then one evening, in the city's most exclusive restaurant, a young waitress with tired eyes and a steady voice approached his table. She wasn't there to take his order. She pointed to a unique, star-shaped mark on his wrist, a secret he thought was his alone, and uttered 7 words that would detonate the foundations of his world. "Hi, sir. My father had the same birthmark." This isn't just a story about a billionaire and a waitress. It's about a 25-year-old lie, a devastating betrayal, and a truth that refused to stay buried. The clinking of silver against porcelain was the only music Alistair Finch tolerated during his solitary dinners. He sat at his usual table in the corner of Aurelia, a Michelin-starred sanctuary in the heart of Manhattan, where privacy was the most expensive item on the menu. The city lights glittered like a sea of scattered diamonds below, but Alistair didn't see them. His gaze was fixed on the intricate dance of numbers scrolling across the screen of his tablet, the pulse of his global empire. At 60, Alistair was a man carved from granite and ambition. His silver-streaked hair was impeccably styled, his suit was a custom-tailored armor of dark gray wool, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. They could assess a company's worth in a glance and dismiss a subordinate with a flicker of disappointment. He was respected, feared, and profoundly alone. He was reviewing the final schematics for a new acquisition in Tokyo when a shadow fell over his table. He didn't look up. "I'll have the usual and another bottle of the 98 Cheval Blanc," he said, his voice a low baritone that expected and received immediate compliance. A moment of silence. This was unusual. The staff at Aurelia were trained to be ghosts, efficient, silent, and invisible. "Sir?" The voice was soft, hesitant, yet clear. It wasn't his usual waiter, Jean-Pierre. Alistair finally lifted his gaze, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He saw a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s. She wore the restaurant's crisp black uniform, but it couldn't hide the weariness in her posture. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face, though pretty, was etched with the subtle lines of someone who worked too hard for too little. Her name tag read Elara. "Is Jean-Pierre ill?" Alistair asked, his tone clipped. "He had a family emergency, sir. I'm covering his section tonight." "I'm Elara," she said, her hands clasped nervously behind her back. Alistair gave a curt nod, his attention already returning to his tablet. "The wine, then?" He dismissed her from his mind, a temporary and insignificant variable in a highly structured evening. He picked up his pen, a sleek Mont Blanc, to make a note in the margin of a document. As his sleeve rode up his wrist, a peculiar birthmark was exposed under the soft glow of the table lamp. It was a small, intricate cluster of darkened pigment, shaped uncannily like a 7-pointed starburst. It had been there his entire life, a unique signature on his skin. He felt her presence again and looked up, irritation hardening his features. Elara hadn't moved. She was staring, not at his face but at his wrist. Her own face was pale, her eyes wide with a look of stunned disbelief. "Is there a problem?" Alistair's voice was cold steel. She seemed to snap out of a trance, a blush creeping up her neck. "No, sir. I apologize. It's just, She trailed off, biting her lip as if debating a terrible risk. She took a small, shaky breath, and the words tumbled out, quiet but resonant in the hushed restaurant. "Hi, sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My father had the same birthmark." The world for Alistair Finch tilted on its axis. Of all the things he had expected, a complaint, a question about the menu, a clumsy attempt at conversation, it was not this. The statement was so absurd, so profoundly impossible, that for a moment he could only stare back at her. "That's a ridiculous thing to say," he said, his voice dangerously low. He pulled his cuff down, hiding the mark. "My father died before I was born, and this mark is a genetic anomaly. It is, to my knowledge, unique." Elara didn't flinch from his glare, though her hands were trembling. "I know it sounds crazy. I'm sorry, but it's identical. The shape, the placement, everything." She unconsciously reached for her own left wrist, her fingers tracing a pattern on her skin through the fabric of her sleeve. My mother always told me it was the one thing he gave me, his mark. Alistair felt a surge of anger mixed with a strange, unsettling chill. He saw this for what it had to be, a scam. A desperate girl in a dead-end job, seeing a wealthy man, concocting a story based on a visible quirk. It was pathetic. Listen to me very carefully, young woman, he said, leaning forward slightly. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it will end now. You will bring me my wine, and then you will have another waiter attend to this table for the rest of the evening. Are we clear? Tears welled in Alara's eyes, not of hurt, but of frustration. It's not a game, sir. I just saw it, and I couldn't not say something. She fumbled with the cuff of her own uniform sleeve. Please, just look. She pushed up the starched white fabric. There, on the pale skin of her own left wrist, was the mark. It wasn't similar. It wasn't a close resemblance. It was a perfect, mirrored replica of his own. A 7-pointed starburst, a tiny, impossible constellation on her skin. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. The logic and order of his world fractured. The numbers on his tablet blurred into meaningless symbols. He saw the mark, and in his mind's eye, he was no longer a 60-year-old billionaire in a restaurant. He was 25 again, standing on a windswept cliff overlooking the sea, and a beautiful, fiery young artist named Isabella Rossi was laughing as she traced the starburst on his wrist. It's our star, she had whispered, her dark eyes full of dreams. If we ever have a child, I hope they have it too, so they'll always carry a piece of our sky with them. Isabella. The name was a ghost on his lips, a phantom pain in his chest he had buried for over 3 decades. Isabella, who had died, along with their unborn child, in a tragic accident all those years ago. He stared at the girl, at Alara, and at the impossible mark on her wrist. The fortress he had built around his heart began to tremble, and the first crack appeared in a lie he never even knew he was living. Alistair left Aurelia without finishing his dinner. The 98 Cheval Blanc remained unopened, a silent ruby-red witness to his abrupt departure. He didn't bark orders at his driver, didn't make a single call. He simply sat in the back of his Rolls-Royce, the plush leather suddenly feeling cold and foreign, and stared out at the blurred city lights, seeing nothing but a girl's wrist and a ghost from his past. His penthouse on Park Avenue was a monument to his success, a vast minimalist space of glass, steel, and Italian marble. It was less a home than a gallery, filled with priceless art that failed to move him and technology that streamlined a life devoid of genuine connection. Tonight, the silence of the place was deafening. He walked past the bar without pouring his usual Macallan 25. He went straight to his study, a room lined with mahogany shelves holding first-edition books he'd never read. Behind a false panel, hidden from the world, was a small, fireproof safe. He hadn't opened it in over a decade. His fingers, usually so steady on the triggers of billion-dollar trades, trembled as he spun the combination. Inside was a single, small, velvet-lined box. It didn't contain stock certificates or rare jewels. It contained the only remnants of a life he had lived before he became Alistair Finch, the titan of industry. He lifted the lid. On top lay a faded photograph. A young woman with a cascade of dark, curly hair and eyes that held both fire and mischief smiled out at him. Isabella Rossi. She was vibrant, alive, a splash of brilliant color in his then monochromatic world. He had met her during a summer away from the suffocating expectations of his wealthy family. He was supposed to be interning at a prestigious bank in London. Instead, he'd taken a car and driven to a small coastal town in Cornwall, craving anonymity. She was a local artist, selling paintings of the dramatic seascapes to tourists. Her hands were perpetually stained with paint, and her laugh was as wild and free as the gulls that swooped over the cliffs. They fell in love with the reckless abandon of youth. For 3 months, he wasn't Alistair Finch, heir to a formidable fortune. He was just Al, a young man in love with a brilliant artist. They dreamed of a future in a small cottage, filled with art and children, far from the world of finance and family pressure. The starburst birthmark on his wrist was their private joke, their secret sigil. The reality of his life inevitably crashed down. His father found him, furious and disappointed. He was dragged back to New York, back to his responsibilities. He and Isabella wrote to each other constantly, their letters filled with desperate promises to reunite. He was saving money, planning to break away from his family for good. He told her he was coming for her. Then Marcus Thorne, his oldest and most trusted friend, had delivered the news. Marcus had gone to Cornwall on his behalf to give Isabella a letter and some money while Alistair finalized his escape plan. But he had returned with a face like stone. There had been an accident, he'd said, a storm, a slippery coastal road. Isabella's car had gone over the cliff. She and their unborn child were gone. The grief had hollowed Alistair out. It was a cold, hard stone in his chest that never went away. He threw himself into his work, using ambition as an anesthetic. He built his empire on the ashes of that love. The cold, calculating logic of the market, a welcome replacement for the chaos of emotion. Marcus was by his side through it all, the ever-loyal friend, the brother he never had, who helped him rebuild his life. Now holding the photograph, the story that had defined his adult life felt thin, like parchment held up to a flame. My father had the same birthmark. The waitress, Lara. Could it be? No, it was a coincidence. A cruel, bizarre, statistically impossible coincidence. He picked up another item from the box. The last letter he ever received from Isabella. Her elegant script, full of life, covered the page. My love, it read, I felt our baby kick for the first time today. I think it has your stubbornness. I touched the mark on my wrist, the one I've imagined for our child, and I know you're with us. Hurry back to me, Al. The world is too quiet without you. The letter was dated 2 weeks before her supposed death. He collapsed into his leather chair, the letter shaking in his hand. For 35 years, he had accepted Marcus's story without question, too broken by grief to doubt his friend. He had built a fortress around his heart to protect himself from that pain, and now a 25-year-old waitress had walked up and knocked a hole right through the main wall. 25 years old. The timing was right. If Isabella had lived, if their child had lived, she would be exactly that age. Was it possible? Could Marcus have lied? Why? It made no sense. Marcus was his confidant, his COO, the man who managed the intricate details of his empire. Their loyalty was the one constant in Alistair's life. A lie of that magnitude was unthinkable. A betrayal so profound would mean his entire life, everything he had built, was a sham. Yet he couldn't erase the image of the girl's wrist, that perfect, 7-pointed star. He stood up and walked to the vast window overlooking Central Park. The city was a grid of cold, logical lights. For the first time in decades, Alistair Finch felt lost. The grief he had buried was not a memory anymore. It was a raw, open wound. And beneath the grief, a dangerous seed of doubt was taking root. Doubt in his past, doubt in his friend, and a terrifying, fragile flicker of hope that felt more painful than the certainty of loss ever had. He had to know the truth, and Alistair Finch always got what he wanted. The next morning, the disciplined calm of Finch Holdings International was shattered by the CEO's uncharacteristic behavior. Alistair Finch arrived at dawn, his face a mask of controlled tension. He canceled his morning meetings, a move that sent ripples of panic through the executive floor. He spent 2 hours locked in his office, not analyzing market trends, but staring at a blank wall. Finally, he made a call, not to a broker or a lawyer, but to a number stored on a heavily encrypted device he rarely used. Genevieve, he said, his voice flat, I have a job for you. Discretion is paramount. Genevieve Reed was a private investigator, but that title was an understatement. She was a ghost, a data miner, a hunter of secrets that the powerful paid fortunes to keep buried. She was the best. 40-something, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an utter lack of sentimentality, she dealt only in facts. They met an hour later in a private room at a discreet club in Midtown. Alistair laid out the bare bones of the story, omitting the emotional context. He spoke of a woman named Isabella Rossi from Cornwall, England. He mentioned a car accident 35 years ago. And he spoke of a young woman in New York named Alara Vance, who bore a striking resemblance to Isabella and possessed a unique hereditary birthmark. I have been operating under the assumption that Isabella Rossi and her unborn child died in that accident, Alistair stated, his voice clinical. I need you to verify that. I want death certificates, police reports, and news clippings. I want to know everything about the event. And then, he paused, the next words tasting like acid. I want you to find out everything there is to know about Ilara Vance. Genevieve listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. What about the man who brought you the news of his death? She asked. His name is Marcus Thorne. He is the COO of my company, Alistair said, the statement hanging in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implication. And you want me to look into him as well, she stated, not as a question. Alistair's jaw tightened. Tread carefully. He is close to me. For now, focus on the historical facts. Find me proof that Isabella Rossi is dead. Genevieve nodded once. You'll have your facts, Mr. Finch. Later that day, Marcus Thorne entered Alistair's office, a sleek leather portfolio under his arm. Marcus was as polished as Alistair was imposing, charming, suave, with an easy smile that disarmed competitors and charmed investors. He and Alistair were a perfect team, the hammer and the scalpel. Bad news on the Nakatomi merger, Marcus began, pulling out a set of documents. Their board is getting cold feet. I think we need to apply a bit more pressure. Alistair waved a dismissive hand, not even looking at the papers. Forget Nakatomi for a moment. He swiveled his chair to face his friend, his gaze steady and intense. Marcus, something strange happened last night. A name I haven't thought of in years came to mind. He let the silence stretch. Isabella Rossi. For a split second, an almost imperceptible flicker of something. Was it panic? Surprise? Crossed Marcus's face before it was replaced by a mask of thoughtful sympathy. Isabella? Marcus said softly, his voice full of practiced melancholy. My God, Al. What brought her to mind after all this time? I'm not sure, Alistair lied smoothly. Age, perhaps. Nostalgia. I was thinking about that trip you took for me, to Cornwall. It must have been terrible for you, having to deliver that news. Marcus leaned against the desk, adopting a posture of shared grief. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Seeing that wreckage, talking to the local constable. He showed me her driver's license from the wallet they recovered. There was no doubt, Al, I know how much you wanted there to be. Every word was a balm, a carefully chosen reassurance, and every word now sounded like a lie. The details are fuzzy now, Alistair pushed, watching Marcus's eyes. What was the name of the town again? And the date of the accident? Marcus's smile was sad. Al, why are you doing this to yourself? It was a lifetime ago. Penzance, I think, or a small village near there. And it was late October. The storms were brutal that year. Please, my friend, let the dead rest. He placed a comforting hand on Alistair's shoulder. The touch which Alistair had accepted as a gesture of brotherhood for decades now felt like the proprietary hand of a jailer. You're right, of course, Alistair said, turning back to his desk. A momentary lapse. Now, about Nakatomi. They spent the next hour dissecting the merger. Their conversation as sharp and familiar as it had been for 30 years. But for Alistair, everything had changed. He saw the subtle calculations behind Marcus's eyes, heard the faint dissonant notes in his reassuring words. He was sitting across from the man he trusted most in the world, and all he could feel was the cold certainty that he was looking at a complete stranger. Meanwhile, in a cramped apartment in Queens, Ilara Vance was also looking to the past. The encounter with Alistair Finch had left her shaken and confused. Her mother, who had passed away a year ago from cancer, had always been evasive about her father. He was a wonderful man, my star catcher, she would say, but he's gone from our lives. She never said he was dead, only gone. Ilara had always respected her mother's silence, but now she needed answers. She pulled out a large dusty box from the back of her mother's closet, a box labeled Memories. Inside were old sketchbooks, dried flowers, and ticket stubs. At the very bottom, wrapped in silk, was a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were unsent. The envelopes were addressed to Al Finch, Finch Tower, New York. Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs. She opened the first one, her hands trembling. Her mother's beautiful handwriting filled the page. "My dearest Al," it began. "I don't know if you'll ever get this. Your friend Marcus came to see me. He told me you had moved on, that your family had arranged a marriage for you. He said you wanted no part of my life or the babies. He gave me money and told me to disappear for your sake. He said if I ever tried to contact you, your family would make sure I regretted it." I don't believe him. I can't. But I saw the look in his eyes, Al. I was scared for our child. So I ran. I took the money and I ran. I've changed my name. But I will never stop loving you. Letter after letter told the same story. A story of a heartbroken woman on the run. A story of a mother protecting her child. A story of a love that never died. The last letter was written only a few years before her mother's death. "My Al, our daughter, Ilara, is a beautiful young woman now. She has your determined eyes and my wild hair, and she has our star on her wrist. Sometimes I see her looking at it, and I know she's wondering about you. I hope one day, somehow, the stars will align for you both. I'm so tired of running, but I've kept my promise. I've kept her safe. Always yours, Isabella." Tears streamed down Ilara's face as she clutched the letters to her chest. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't a coincidence. That man in the restaurant, the cold, powerful billionaire Alistair Finch, was her father. And he hadn't abandoned them. He had been lied to, just as her mother had. The truth in all its devastating, heartbreaking clarity was finally in her hands. Genevieve Reed worked with the silent, relentless efficiency of a predator. Within 72 hours, her initial report landed in Alistair Finch's encrypted inbox. The subject line was a single, stark word: discrepancies. Alistair opened the file, his heart hammering against his ribs. Genevieve's findings were laid out in a series of cold, hard bullet points. No record of death. Extensive searches of coroner's records, police archives, and news databases in Cornwall and the surrounding counties for the last quarter of 1990 show no reported death for an Isabella Rossi. No Jane Doe matched her description. No record of accident. There were no police reports or news clippings detailing a fatal car accident on the coastal roads near Penzance during the specified time frame. A trail of breadcrumbs. Isabella Rossi's legal identity effectively vanished in November 1990. However, a woman matching her description, using the name Isabella Vance, purchased a train ticket from Penzance to London on October 28th, the day after Marcus claimed to have identified her body. The financial link. The most damning piece of evidence was a financial transaction. On October 27, 1990, a shell corporation owned by the Thorne family, Marcus's family, made a cash withdrawal of $50,000 from a bank in London. On the same day, Marcus Thorne was documented as flying from London to New York. The money was never accounted for in any of the Thorne family's business ledgers. It was a ghost payment. Alistair read the report 3 times, each word a hammer blow against the foundations of his life. There was no accident. There was no death. There was only a lie paid for with $50,000. Marcus hadn't delivered news. He had orchestrated a disappearance. The betrayal was so vast, so complete, it was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just about a lost love. Marcus had stolen his child. He had allowed Alistair to grieve for a living woman and a daughter he never knew he had. He had stood by his side for 35 years, a pillar of support, all while knowing the truth. Every shared drink, every word of advice, every moment of perceived friendship was now tainted, revealed as a grotesque charade. Why? The question screamed in Alistair's mind. Was it jealousy? A desire for control? Had Marcus been in love with Isabella himself? Or was it something colder, a calculated move to keep Alistair focused, unattached, and reliant only on him, ensuring his own place at the right hand of the king? His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Thorne is here to see you, sir." "Send him in," Alistair said, his voice eerily calm. As he waited, he received another message. It was a simple text from an unknown number. "Mr. Finch, it's Ilara Vance. I think you need to see these. I can meet you." Attached was a single image, a close-up of her mother's handwriting on an old letter, the words "Your friend Marcus came to see me," clearly visible. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. Alistair now had the story from both sides. He had Genevieve's cold facts and Alara's heartbreaking truth. Marcus walked in, that familiar, confident smile on his face. "Good news," he said, holding up a file. "I managed to flip one of Nakatomi's board members. They're ready to capitulate." Alistair didn't look at the file. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, Marcus." Something in his tone made Marcus's smile falter. He sat, his posture suddenly less relaxed. "I had my investigator look into an old matter," Alistair began, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "A car accident in Cornwall, 35 years ago." Marcus's composure was flawless. He simply raised an eyebrow. "Al, we talked about this. I really think you should let it go." "I can't," Alistair said, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "Because she found something interesting. Or rather, she found nothing. No police report, no death certificate, no wreckage. It's almost as if it never happened." Marcus chuckled, a dry, nervous sound. "Well, it was a small town in the middle of nowhere. Record-keeping back then wasn't what it is today. You can't seriously be questioning what happened." "Oh, I'm questioning everything," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He slid a printed copy of the bank transaction across the desk. $50,000, withdrawn by a Thorne family shell company on the very day you were supposedly identifying my dead girlfriend's body. Where did that money go, Marcus?" The color drained from Marcus's face. The mask of friendship dissolved, replaced by the cornered look of a liar caught in the spotlight. He stared at the paper, speechless. "And then there are the letters," Alistair continued, his voice rising with a cold, contained fury he hadn't felt in years. "Unsent letters from Isabella to me. Letters she wrote after she was supposed to be dead. She wrote about a visit from you, Marcus. She wrote about how you told her I'd abandoned her, how you threatened her, how you gave her money and told her to disappear." He stood up, his towering frame casting a shadow over his oldest friend. The pretense was over. "You didn't just lie to me," Alistair snarled, the words raw with decades of stolen grief. "You buried her alive. You stole my daughter. You stood by my side at my parents' funerals. You were the best man at my short-lived, disastrous wedding. You have been my brother in all but blood, and every single second of it was a lie." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes filled not with remorse but with a strange, twisted resentment. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Then make me understand," Alistair roared, slamming his fists on the desk, the sound echoing through the cavernous office. "Make me understand why you would commit a betrayal so monstrous, so evil, that there is no word for it in any language." The confrontation had begun. The truth was out, and the damage was absolute. The silence in the office was a living thing, thick with the weight of 35 years of deceit. Marcus Thorne, the man who had navigated hostile takeovers and corporate espionage with unflappable cool, now looked like a ghost, his face ashen, his composure shattered. "I did it for you, Al," he finally said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "You have to believe me." Alistair let out a short, brutal laugh that held no humor. "For me? You tore my life apart for me? You let me believe my child was dead for me? That is the most pathetic, self-serving excuse I have ever heard." "She would have destroyed you," Marcus shot back, a flicker of his old fire returning, fueled by a desperate need for justification. "Can't you see that? You were the heir to the Finch fortune. Your father was grooming you to take over, and you were ready to throw it all away for some small-town painter. You were talking about living in a cottage, Al? A cottage! You who were born to rule this city." He stood up, pacing in front of the window, his movements agitated. "Your father would have disinherited you without a second thought. You would have been cut off, left with nothing. Your entire future, everything we talked about building together, it would have all turned to dust because of a summer fling." "It wasn't a fling," Alistair roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I loved her. She was carrying my child. You had no right to make that decision for me. It wasn't your life to control." "It was," Marcus insisted, turning to face him, his eyes blazing with a conviction that was chilling in its sincerity. "Our lives were intertwined. I've been by your side since we were boys at boarding school. I watched you build this empire, but I was the one in the trenches, greasing the wheels, making the hard choices you were too sentimental to make. I laid the foundations. I protected you from your own weaknesses. The word weaknesses hung in the air, a stunning revelation of Marcus's true perception of their relationship. He didn't see Alistair as a partner, but as a flawed asset to be managed. Isabella was your biggest weakness, Marcus continued, his voice dropping as he recounted the story. When you sent me to Cornwall, I saw my chance to save you from yourself. I told her exactly what your father would do, that he would ruin her, that he would fight for custody of the child and make sure she never saw it again. I told her you had already chosen your family over her. It wasn't hard to convince her. She was a scared, pregnant girl. Alistair felt a wave of nausea. He pictured Isabella, alone and terrified, being fed these poisonous lies by the man he trusted most. The money was a kindness, Marcus said, a diluted nobility in his tone. It was to give her a new start, far away where she couldn't hurt you. And the story of her death, that was a kindness to you. It was better for you to have a clean break, to grieve and move on, than to live your life wondering, always looking over your shoulder. I gave you closure. I gave you the freedom to become the man you were meant to be. The man you wanted me to be. Alistair corrected him, his voice dangerously quiet. A man without attachments, a man who relied on no one but you. This wasn't about protecting me. This was about controlling me. And what about you, Marcus? Was there another reason? Were you in love with her? Marcus flinched as if struck. He turned away, staring out the window at the empire he had helped build. She was a beautiful distraction, he said evasively, but she wasn't for you. She wasn't for our world. The denial was all the confirmation Alistair needed. He saw it all now, a toxic cocktail of jealousy, ambition, and a twisted, possessive sense of friendship. Marcus hadn't just wanted Alistair's success. He had wanted to be the sole architect of it, removing any variable, any person that he couldn't control. Isabella and their child were the biggest variables of all. Get out, Alistair said, the words falling like chips of ice into the silence. Marcus turned, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. What? Get out of my office, out of my building, out of my life. Alistair walked to his desk and pressed the button on his intercom. Security to my office, immediately. Mr. Thorne will be escorted from the premises. His access is revoked, effective immediately. Panic finally set in on Marcus's face. Al, don't do this. Think about what this will do to the company, the board, the shareholders. We're in the middle of the Nakatomi deal. You need me. The company will survive, Alistair said, his voice cold as a tomb. It's just business. You taught me that. Nothing is indispensable. Two large security guards entered the office. Their professional expressions didn't betray a hint of surprise as they flanked the company's COO. Marcus stared at Alistair, his face contorted with desperation and rage. You're making a mistake. You're throwing away 35 years of loyalty for a waitress you just met. You're wrong, Alistair said, his gaze unwavering. I'm throwing away 35 years of lies for the daughter I never got to meet. And you were never loyal. You were just a parasite. As the security guards led a protesting Marcus Thorne from the room, Alistair Finch finally collapsed into his chair. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a vast, empty chasm. He had won the confrontation, exposed the lie, and banished the traitor, but the victory felt hollow. He had lost his best friend, his past, and 35 years of his life to a phantom. He picked up his phone and found the number Alara had texted him from. His thumb hovered over the call button. He was no longer just a billionaire who had been wronged. He was a father, and he had a quarter-century of lost time to account for. The thought was more terrifying than any market crash he had ever faced. They met at a small, unassuming cafe in Greenwich Village, a place Alara had chosen. It was a world away from the polished grandeur of Aurelia or the cold austerity of Alistair's office. The air smelled of coffee and old books, and the clientele were students and artists who paid no mind to the impeccably dressed man sitting awkwardly at a small wooden table. Alistair had arrived first, a rare occurrence for a man whose time was measured in thousands of dollars per minute. He had changed out of his suit and into a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, a conscious effort to appear less like a titan of industry and more like a father. The role felt alien, a suit of clothes that didn't fit. When Alara walked in, he stood up. She looked different from the weary waitress he'd met. In her own clothes, jeans and a simple green sweater, she looked younger, more vulnerable. She carried a canvas tote bag from which the corners of a book were peeking out. She had his eyes. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. That same determined, steady gaze. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet. "Alistair," he corrected her, his own voice rougher than he intended. "Please, call me Alistair." The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of what-ifs and why-nots. Ilara clutched the letters, still in their silk wrapping, on her lap. "I read your mother's letters," Alistair said, breaking the silence. "The ones you sent me a picture of. I met with a source who confirmed the details. Everything you thought, everything she wrote, it was true. He lied to both of us." Ilara nodded, her gaze fixed on the table. "She never spoke ill of you. She always said you were a good man who was taken from her. I never understood what she meant until I found these." "She was a remarkable woman," Alistair said, the words catching in his throat. "Fierce and brilliant and so full of life. You look like her, but your eyes are mine." A tear slipped down Alara's cheek and she quickly wiped it away. "All my life I felt like a piece of me was missing. I had this wonderful mother, but there was always a shadow, a question I was too afraid to ask. I think I didn't want to hear that my father had just left. It was easier to live with the mystery." "I would never have left," Alistair said, the conviction in his voice absolute. "Never. I loved your mother more than I understood was possible. And the thought of our child, it was the only thing that gave my life meaning back then. Believing I had lost you both, it broke something in me. Something I never got back." This was the hardest part, the apology that could never be enough. "Ilara," he began, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the table. "The words 'I'm sorry' are so laughably inadequate for what you've lost. You grew up without a father. You struggled. You watched your mother work herself to the bone to provide for you. You faced her illness and her death alone. And all that time, I was in the city living in a different universe, with more money than any human needs, and I didn't even know you existed. I failed you. I failed you before I even had a chance to be your father. And for that, I am so profoundly sorry." His voice was thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. The apology wasn't for her, not really. It was for him, a desperate plea for a forgiveness he knew he hadn't earned. Ilara looked up, and he saw the years of quiet strength in her gaze. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "You were a victim in this too. Marcus Thorne didn't just steal my father from me. He stole his daughter from you. We both lost." Her grace was more humbling than any accusation could have been. They talked for 2 hours. Ilara spoke of her mother, sharing anecdotes that brought Isabella vividly to life, her quirky sense of humor, her love for stormy weather, the way she hummed when she painted. Alistair, in turn, shared his own memories of that brief, magical summer, painting a picture of the young man he had been before grief had calmed him. They were two strangers, connected by a ghost and a birthmark, trying to piece together a shared history that had been stolen from them. It was awkward and painful, but underneath it all, a fragile thread of connection began to form. "What do you do, Ilara?" Alistair asked. "Besides working at the restaurant?" "I'm studying," she said. "Or I was. I had to take a break when my mom got sick and the debt. Well, I'm studying architectural history. I love old buildings, the way they hold stories. An architect of stories. It was so perfectly Isabella's daughter." "I want to help," Alistair said immediately. "Your tuition, your debts, anything you need. I want to give you the life you should have had." Ilara held up a hand, a gesture so resolute it reminded him powerfully of her mother. I appreciate that, more than you know, but I need to do this on my own terms. I'm not looking for a rescue, Alistair. I was just looking for the truth. She gave a small, wry smile. Though I will quit my job at Aurelia, effective immediately. Alistair nodded, understanding. He couldn't buy back the lost years. He couldn't erase the hardship. All he could do was be present now. A few days later, he took Alara to a small private cemetery upstate, where he had, 35 years ago, erected a headstone for Isabella and their unnamed child. The inscription read, Isabella Rossi, beloved star catcher, forever in my sky. They stood before the cold stone together. I came here every year on the anniversary, Alistair confessed, his voice heavy. I would talk to her, tell her about my year. It was the only time I let myself feel anything. Alara reached out and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers, Isabella's favorite, at the base of the stone. She's not here, Alara said gently. She's buried in a small churchyard in Vermont, under a willow tree, with her name, Isabella Vance. She looked at her father, her eyes clear. Maybe we can go visit her together sometime. Alistair looked from the empty grave that had been the focus of his grief to the living, breathing daughter by his side. The past was a place of lies and sorrow. The future, for the first time in a very long time, felt like a possibility. I would like that very much, he said. 6 months passed. The autumn that had brought the shocking revelation gave way to a harsh winter and then melted into the tentative green of spring. The changes in Alistair Finch's life were both seismic and subtle. The fallout from Marcus Thorne's dismissal was a brutal, public affair. Marcus, stripped of his power and reputation, attempted to fight back, leaking stories to the press and filing lawsuits. But Alistair, armed with Genevieve's ironclad evidence and a signed confession from the retired bank manager in London, who had handled the cash withdrawal, was relentless. Marcus Thorne was professionally and socially annihilated, a disgraced ghost in the world he had once manipulated so masterfully. Finch Holdings International weathered the storm, its foundations shaken but not broken. The real transformation, however, was happening inside the man himself. The glass walls of his penthouse seemed to have grown windows. Alistair started leaving the office before midnight. He sold a portion of his art collection and used the funds to create the Isabella Rossi Foundation, a massive grant program for struggling young artists. He began to delegate, to trust the team he had built, realizing that his grip did not need to be absolute. His relationship with Alara grew slowly, cautiously, like a rare and delicate plant. It was not a fairy tale reunion. There were no dramatic scenes of tearful embraces in the rain. Instead, their connection was built in a series of small, quiet moments. They met for coffee on Sundays. He attended a lecture with her on Gothic Revival architecture, listening with genuine fascination as she pointed out the intricacies of a flying buttress. She, in turn, visited his office, not intimidated by the scale of it, but curious about the world he inhabited. She looked at his stock charts and market analyses and said, "It's just patterns, like brushstrokes. You're an artist too, in your own way." No one had ever said that to him before. Alara had, as promised, refused his offer to pay off her debts. But she did accept a long-term, no-interest loan from the Isabella Rossi Foundation, on the condition that she was treated like any other applicant. She re-enrolled in her master's program at Columbia University and flourished. Freed from the crushing weight of financial desperation, her sharp mind and passion for her subject shone through. One bright Saturday afternoon in May, Alistair met her in Central Park. He was early, sitting on a bench near the reservoir, not looking at his phone, but simply watching the city live around him. When Alara arrived, she was carrying a large sketchbook. "What's that?" he asked with a smile. "An idea," she said, sitting beside him. She opened it to a page filled with elegant drawings. They were designs for a small public library and art space, designed to be built in an underserved community in the Bronx. The architecture was modern but warm, with wide windows and natural materials. "I call it the Vance Rossi Center," she said quietly. "A place for stories and art. For my mother." Alistair looked at the detailed, passionate drawings. He saw Isabella's artistic soul and Ilara's brilliant, structured mind combined into something new and beautiful. He saw a legacy not of wealth or power, but of creativity and community. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with pride, a feeling so new and overwhelming it almost brought him to his knees. "The foundation will fund the entire project, and I'll match every dollar personally." Ilara looked at him, her smile reaching her eyes. His eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." She closed the book and rested her head on his shoulder for a moment. It was a simple, easy gesture of affection, one that spoke volumes more than any grand declaration. At that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. She wasn't a long-lost heir. They were just a father and a daughter, sitting on a bench in the park, designing a future together. Alistair looked down at his left wrist, at the starburst pattern that had been a lifelong mark of solitude. Now he knew it was one half of a match set. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a map that had, against all odds, led him home. The truth had not just unfolded, it had remade his world, replacing a lonely star with an entirely new constellation. Alistair and Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, has a way of finding the light. It's a testament to the fact that family isn't just about blood, but about the fight to find each other across years of silence and deceit. Their journey from a shocking revelation in a restaurant to building a shared future shows us that it's never too late to heal, to connect, and to rewrite your own story. The birthmark that started it all became a symbol not of a painful past, but of a hopeful future, proving that our deepest connections are often written on our very skin, waiting to be read. If this story of destiny, deceit, and the unbreakable bond of family moved you, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of profound human connection, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas that will touch your heart and make you think. Thank you for listening.